They changed the locks on the house I bought, and when I tried to turn the key, the door wouldn't open. That moment, the click, the cold resistance of a lock I no longer controlled, felt like a shutter slamming down on a chapter of my life I never wanted to end. My daughter, Melissa, stood on the other side of that door, calm, but with a certainty that was chilling. "We thought it was time," she said, as if I were a child too fragile to understand what time meant. "It's for your safety," she added, her voice soft but unyielding, like an unspoken verdict delivered in a courtroom I had no seat in. At 74, I have lived long enough to know what it means when someone speaks softly but carries a heavy intention. I had lived in that house for over 20 years, a home I had painstakingly maintained and paid for with my own savings, a place filled with memories of laughter and tears, a place where my late husband's photo still rested on the mantel, where the dog I had raised until last year used to curl up at my feet in the evenings. But now I stood outside, the key heavy in my hand, a relic of a past life. While my daughter held the future behind a lock, I no longer held the combination too. That day, I had returned from a hospital visit, a minor fall that had left me shaken, but determined to come home to my own bed, my own space, my own life. The hospital staff had been kind, helpful even, but they warned me about the dangers of living alone, the risks of falls, of confusion. When I told Melissa I was coming back home, she had been hesitant, nervous even, but I reassured her. I was not a child. I could take care of myself, or so I thought. Yet, when I tried to open my door, that lock told a different story. She had changed it without telling me, without asking me, as though I had become a stranger in the place where I had once been queen. The hallway outside my front door, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a threshold to exile. My bags were inside, packed from a lifetime of Sundays and holidays, but the lock was a gate I could not cross. I remember standing there, the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders, trying to find a way inside, both literally and figuratively. It was not just a door I was barred from, but from my dignity, from the years I had built that home, from the stories held within its walls. My daughter, who once hugged me tightly when I fell ill, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and control, as though I were a fragile artifact that needed to be preserved behind glass, admired but not touched. "Mom," she said, "this is better. You need help, and we're here to give it." But her words rang hollow in the empty space where my independence used to live. The furniture had been rearranged. My favorite chair was missing, replaced with an oversized recliner that seemed designed for someone who no longer moved much. The walls were painted a different color, and my late husband's picture was nowhere to be found. When I asked about it, Melissa said it was stored safely, a phrase that felt more like a removal than preservation. That evening, as I sat on the edge of the guest room bed Melissa had reluctantly offered me, I realized that home was no longer a place, but a concept slipping through my fingers. The house was hers now. I was a visitor in a place I once called sanctuary. The dog Max, who used to greet me at the door with a wagging tail and hopeful eyes, now recoiled when I approached, hesitant and confused. I understood then that this was more than just a change of locks. It was a change of roles, a silent declaration that my place in the family, in that house, was being rewritten without my consent or even my knowledge. In the quiet moments that followed, I thought about all the small ways this had crept up on me. The mail that stopped coming to my address and was rerouted to Melissa's care. The phone calls I missed because the line was now on her account. The grocery shopping that had once been a shared task became a chore she did without me. Even the neighbors, who used to wave and stop for a chat, now glanced quickly away, as if unsure what to say to a woman who had been suddenly pushed aside. I felt invisible, not because I was old, but because I was being erased, line by line, moment by moment. Yet beneath the sting of exclusion, there was a flicker of something else, a quiet, stubborn ember of resistance. I was not ready to disappear, not ready to be locked out of my own life. I remembered the keys I kept hidden in a small box under my bed, the deeds to the house tucked away in a folder that had traveled with me through years of illness and family dramas. I had paid for that house. I had earned it with years of sacrifice and work. That lock might have changed, but the ownership had not. It was a reminder that I still held power, even if I had forgotten how to wield it. I was tired, yes. Tired of fighting invisible battles and losing small pieces of myself every day. But in that tiredness, there was clarity. I would find a way back in, not by asking, not by pleading, but by taking what was rightfully mine. The house was not just bricks and mortar. It was a testament to a life lived with dignity and hard work, and I was not about to let it slip away because my daughter decided it was easier to lock me out than to face the truth of who I still was. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the muffled sounds of the house I once called home filtering through the thin walls. I thought about the years that had passed, about the mother I had been, and the woman I still was beneath the weariness. The house was a symbol, yes, but it was also a battleground, a place where love and control clashed in silent wars. I wasn't sure what the next day would bring, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The lock on that door might have changed, but I still held the key to myself, and I intended to use it. The moment I understood that this was no accident or a temporary measure came not from my daughter's words, but from the silence that followed my attempts to reclaim what was mine. I had spent the morning trying the key again, hoping perhaps I had been mistaken, or that the lock had jammed in some way that a locksmith could easily fix. The stubborn refusal of the door to open felt like a final, cold barrier between me and the life I had known. When Melissa answered my call later that day, her voice was calm, almost clinical, when she explained that the locks had been changed weeks ago, that it was all arranged by her and my son as part of a plan to keep me safe. I listened, the words washing over me with a strange mixture of disbelief and deepening hurt. But I said nothing at first, because denial was easier than confrontation. It was when I found the letter tucked away inside a stack of unopened mail that had been forwarded to Melissa's address that the truth settled like a stone in my stomach. The letter was from the locksmith, dated 2 weeks before my hospital visit, confirming the work done on the locks and the installation of a security system that required a new code. The fact that I had not been informed nor consulted was not just oversight. It was an intentional exclusion, a deliberate erasure of my agency. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, and tried to process what this meant. The house I had called home was no longer mine in practice, even if the deed still bore my name. It was a legal fiction, a document that mattered little against the weight of control wielded behind closed doors. The realization that my own daughter had orchestrated this without so much as a discussion was a betrayal deeper than any argument or harsh word could have been. It was a silent declaration that I was no longer trusted, that I was no longer welcome as the woman who had built that life. When I confronted Melissa that evening, hoping for some explanation, some trace of the mother I once knew, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Mom, you've been unsafe for too long," she said softly. "We're just trying to protect you. You don't remember everything clearly anymore, and you're vulnerable. This is what's best for you." Her words, meant as comfort, landed like accusations. Vulnerable. Incapable. a phrase that rang louder than any shout, louder than any fight. I knew the signs of condescension disguised as care because I had seen them all my life. This was not care. This was control. As the days passed, the house became a museum of memories I was not allowed to touch. The kitchen counters were spotless but sterile, my favorite cups replaced by disposable ones. The garden, once tended by my own hands, was now pruned by strangers, and the scent of unfamiliar fertilizers filled the air where the old rose bushes used to bloom. My belongings were packed away or discarded under the guise of decluttering, a euphemism for making me disappear. I watched from the guest room window as Melissa walked through the rooms, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floors, issuing instructions to contractors and cleaners as though she were the owner of every inch. I was reduced to a shadow, a guest in my own life, waiting for moments when she wasn't looking to slip inside and touch the walls that still whispered my name. But the catalyst, the moment everything shifted from quiet resignation to urgent need, was not just the change of locks or the rearrangement of furniture. It was the conversation I overheard one afternoon, hidden behind the door of the guest room, where I was supposed to be silent and invisible. Melissa was on the phone, her voice low but sharp, speaking to someone whose tone was equally serious. "Yes," she said. She's still confused. "We need to make sure everything is handled legally before she tries anything. The sooner the guardianship papers are filed, the better." The word guardianship hung in the air like a guillotine blade, descending slowly but inevitably. It was the end of choice, the final severing of my right to say no. I felt something break inside me at that moment, a fragile thread snapping that had held me to the hope of respect and dignity. I was not ready to be a ward, a patient, a problem to be solved by legal documents and court hearings. I was still a woman, still capable of thought and decision, still fiercely attached to the life I had earned. That conversation galvanized me. It was no longer about waiting for permission or hoping for kindness. It was about taking back what was mine, not just the house, but my identity, my voice, my freedom. I started to make quiet plans, small steps that felt like rebellion in a life too long dictated by others. I called the locksmith's office under the pretense of needing a check on the security system and gleaned information about the new locks and codes. I contacted a legal aid clinic, gathering information about property rights and elder law, about how a woman could stand firm when her own blood sought to erase her. The betrayal was personal, but it was also universal. It was a story told in hushed tones in countless homes where the elderly are sidelined, where love is twisted into control, where safety is weaponized as a cage. I felt the weight of history in that moment, the many women who had been pushed out, dismissed, and forgotten. But I also felt the flicker of resilience, a quiet strength born from decades of survival. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I stood in the guest room doorway, looking out toward the garden I once planted. The locks might have changed, but I had not. The house might be controlled by my daughter now, but my heart still beat with the knowledge that this was my home, my life, and I would find a way back in. That night, I sat with a pen and paper, drafting a letter not for Melissa, but for myself, a promise to fight, to remember who I was beyond the changing tides of family and fortune. The catalyst was no longer a moment of shock or silence, but a call to action, a spark that set the course for the days to come. I was ready to reclaim the keys, the house, and most importantly, my dignity. After the shock of discovering that the locks had been changed, and the painful realization that my own daughter had taken control away from me, life settled into a slow, steady erosion of the familiar. The days that followed, were not marked by loud confrontations or dramatic scenes, but by a quiet, almost invisible worsening of my situation. A gradual slipping away of the life I had known, piece by piece, as if my existence was being rewritten by unseen hands. I woke each morning in the guest room that Melissa had set up for me, a small space at the back of the house that was clean but sterile, with pale walls and a thin mattress that seemed to absorb all the warmth I tried to bring to it. I would lie there for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards under footsteps that were not mine, the faint hum of conversations in rooms I was no longer welcome in, and I would feel a familiar ache settle into my chest, the ache of invisibility. The mail stopped coming to my name. What letters and bills I received were now forwarded to Melissa, who took it upon herself to manage everything. I discovered this one afternoon when I reached for an envelope that contained an invitation to a reunion of old friends. The envelope was thick and smelled faintly of lavender, a scent I had chosen for myself decades ago, and yet when I opened it, the invitation was blank, the words carefully erased with a marker, as though someone had decided I was no longer meant to attend the gathering. When I asked Melissa about it, she brushed it off with a tired sigh, telling me it was probably a mistake, and there were so many things to keep track of now. But I knew better. I knew the gentle severing of ties was deliberate. It was a slow pruning, like the trimming of branches from a tree until nothing recognizable remained. The kitchen, once the heart of our home, became a place I was seldom allowed to enter. Melissa took over the shopping and cooking, dismissing my suggestions as outdated or impractical. The cupboards were filled with unfamiliar brands and brightly colored packages that bore no resemblance to the simple, wholesome foods I had always favored. My favorite coffee mug, the one with a tiny chip on the rim that I refused to throw away, was nowhere to be found. When I asked, Melissa said it had broken, but I suspected it had been quietly discarded. I missed the rituals, the sound of the coffee grinder, the warmth of the mug in my hands, the way the kitchen smelled on a Sunday morning when I baked bread. These small losses felt like echoes of a life slipping away. My late husband's photograph, which had once stood proudly on the mantel in a silver frame, had vanished. When I inquired, Melissa told me it had been put away safely in storage. I imagined it, face down in a dusty box, forgotten like so many other reminders of the past. The chair where I had sat every evening to knit or read was replaced by a recliner that swallowed me whole and had buttons that hummed with electric heat. It was not my chair, not my space. Even Max, the old golden retriever who had been my constant companion, seemed to sense the shift. He no longer greeted me with the same enthusiasm, instead retreating to Melissa's side as if choosing the new master of the house. The dog's change in behavior was a silent, heartbreaking confirmation of my diminishing presence. Neighbors, who had once waved and stopped for conversation, now offered only quick nods or averted eyes. I could feel the distance growing, as if a wall had been erected around me, not a physical one, but a barrier of social exclusion that was harder to overcome. It was not that they no longer cared, but that they had been quietly instructed, or had simply accepted, that I was no longer the woman they knew. I was becoming a story whispered behind closed doors, a cautionary tale of a mother who had been quietly edged out of her own family. The loneliness was profound, not just of body, but of spirit, a silence that stretched like a desert between me and the world I once inhabited. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of my erasure. At family gatherings, I was introduced as Mom's guest or a distant relative, terms that felt like thin veils to hide the uncomfortable truth that I was no longer part of the family. Conversation stopped when I entered the room, and I was careful not to ask questions that might draw attention. I became a ghost, present in body, but absent in presence. The weight of invisibility pressed down on me, a suffocating cloak woven from years of neglect and silence. During this time, I began to notice how the small decisions Melissa made, supposedly for my benefit, were acts of control disguised as kindness. She insisted on accompanying me to medical appointments, speaking over me to doctors and nurses, answering questions I had not yet been asked. When I suggested I might be capable of managing my own medications, she smiled kindly, but said, "It's safer this way." Her words were gentle but firm, a reminder that my independence was being quietly dismantled. I tried to speak up, to assert myself, but each attempt was met with a polite but unyielding resistance. It was as if my voice had been muted, my opinions no longer relevant in a life being managed by others. The house itself became a symbol of my confinement. I was allowed in certain rooms, but discouraged from entering others. Doors that once stood open were now closed, their locks a reminder of boundaries drawn without my consent. The guest room where I slept was comfortable but isolating, a gilded cage that kept me near but separate. I spent hours sitting by the window, watching the world move on without me, wondering how so many small moments had passed unnoticed, how the distance between us had grown so wide without a single word spoken. And yet, beneath the growing isolation, a quiet fire began to kindle within me. Each day of erasure and exclusion chipped away at the veneer of acceptance I had tried to maintain. I realized that this slow disappearance was not inevitable, that the life I had known was not a faded photograph to be boxed and shelved, but a living story I still had the power to write. The first escalation was not a sudden blow, but a steady pressure, a tide pulling me away from the shore. But I was learning to swim against the current. One evening, after Melissa had gone to bed, I found myself wandering through the rooms of the house, touching objects that felt like fragments of my past. An old quilt folded on the back of a sofa, a book left open on a side table, a pair of slippers, by the fireplace that no longer fit. These small relics were anchors to a life slipping away, but still within reach. I sat in my favorite chair, the one Melissa had not yet replaced, and let the silence envelop me. It was a silence heavy with loss, but also pregnant with possibility. I knew then that the journey ahead would not be easy, that reclaiming my place would require strength I was not sure I had. But I also knew that I could not remain invisible any longer. The slow erosion of my world had begun, but it had not finished. Each day brought new challenges, small but relentless, but also new moments of clarity and resolve. I began to keep a journal, writing down the details of my days, the conversations I overheard, the feelings I struggled to name. Writing became a way to anchor myself, to remember who I was beneath the fading light of exclusion. It was in those pages that I first dared to imagine a future where I was no longer a ghost, but a woman reclaimed, a life restored. And so, the first escalation was not a dramatic event, but a creeping shadow, a subtle shift that threatened to erase me quietly, but completely. It was a test of my endurance, a call to awaken from the numbness of acceptance and step back into the light of my own life. The locks might have been changed, the chair replaced, and the dog trained to obey another's voice, but inside me, a seed of defiance was beginning to grow, quietly but unmistakably. I was still here, still fighting, and still holding on to the hope that one day I would open that door again, not as a visitor, but as the rightful owner of my own story. There was a day, not marked by any grand event or sudden confrontation, but by a quiet moment in a city park that I realized the true weight of what I had lost and what I still might reclaim. I sat on a worn wooden bench, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting a soft green glow over the cracked pavement and the scattered handfuls of autumn leaves that danced in the gentle breeze. Around me, life moved on in its usual rhythms, children chasing each other with wild laughter, an elderly man feeding pigeons with careful hands, couples strolling slowly and speaking in hushed tones. In the midst of this ordinary scene, I watched a woman walk by wearing a bright red coat, the kind of coat I had once dreamed of owning, a small dog trotting obediently beside her on a leather leash. She moved with a confidence I had not felt in months, her steps sure and steady, her gaze fixed ahead without hesitation or apology. She did not ask for help, did not seek permission, did not apologize for taking up space in the world. She just walked, and something inside me stirred. The contrast between her quiet strength and my own recent invisibility was a jolt, a reminder that I was not as diminished as the changing locks and silent house might have suggested. It was as though the world was still open to me, still waiting for me to claim it, if only I could find the courage. That afternoon, sitting there in the park, I thought of the box I had hidden beneath my bed, the folder containing the deed to the house that still bore my name. It had been a secret kept from my daughter and son, a quiet assertion of ownership and autonomy that I had held on to even as my role in the family shifted and shrank. The deed was more than paper. It was a symbol, a lifeline, a tangible proof that I had not been erased, no matter how much the locks might say otherwise. That evening, after the quiet of the park had settled into the hush of twilight, I found myself searching through old papers, dusting off memories folded into brittle documents. I pulled out the deed and held it in my hands, tracing the embossed letters of my name with trembling fingers. It was a small victory, a reclaiming of power in the midst of powerlessness. The house was legally mine, not my daughter's or my son's. That knowledge settled in my bones like a shield. It was not enough to undo the control that had been taken from me, but it was a beginning, a first step toward reclaiming what was rightfully mine. That night, while the house around me settled into quiet sleep, I reached for the phone and looked up the number of a locksmith I had found in the phone book, a small advertisement tucked between pages I had never cared to notice before. The thought of changing the locks again, of regaining the ability to open my own door, was both thrilling and terrifying. I hesitated, imagining the confrontation that might follow, the anger, the disbelief, the inevitable accusations of stubbornness or confusion. But beneath the fear was a stubborn ember of determination. This was not just about a door. It was about reclaiming my dignity and autonomy, about refusing to be written out of my own story. In the days that followed, I began to take small actions that felt like ripples in a still pond. I called the locksmith, not to ask permission, but to inquire, to plan, to prepare. I gathered information about my rights, about how to assert ownership, even when family ties threatened to unravel. I made a list of people who could help, a neighbor who owed me kindness, a local legal aid office, a friend from the community center who had once helped a woman in a similar situation. Each step was quiet but deliberate, a reclamation of agency that no one could take away without a fight. This shift was not a sudden burst of rebellion, but a slow unfolding of awareness and courage. I began to speak more clearly, to assert myself in small ways, to push back gently against the boundaries that had been set without my consent. When Melissa tried to dismiss my concerns or brush aside my questions, I held firm, repeating my truths with calm resolve. It was exhausting, and sometimes I faltered, but I refused to be silenced. I reminded myself that my voice still mattered, that my experiences were valid, and that the years I had lived were not erased by the changing tides of family dynamics. The house, once a place of exclusion, began to feel different, less like a cage and more like a battlefield where I could fight for my place. I spent hours sitting by the window in the guest room. Watching the light shift across the rooms I was not allowed to enter freely, imagining what it would feel like to walk through those doors with the keys in my own hand once more. I thought about the old quilt folded on the sofa, the worn books on the shelves, the memories embedded in every corner. This was my home, still, even if others had tried to claim it. One afternoon, as the leaves turned from green to gold, I visited the local community center, a place I had once frequented years ago. The familiar faces and the gentle hum of activity were comforting, reminders that the world beyond my immediate family was still vibrant and welcoming. I signed up for a knitting group and a weekly book club, small steps that helped me reclaim not just my space at home, but my place in the world. These activities became lifelines, moments of connection and purpose that fueled my resolve to reclaim my life. The emotional shift was subtle but profound. I moved from a place of quiet resignation to one of cautious hope. I was no longer waiting for permission or acceptance. I was beginning to chart my own course, to walk my own path. The woman in the red coat and her little dog were symbols of a life I still aspired to, a life of movement, choice, and dignity. As the days shortened and the first frost kissed the windows, I found myself growing stronger, more determined, more certain that the future held possibilities beyond exclusion and control. The locks on the door might have been changed once, but I was ready to change them again, ready to hold the keys in my own hands, ready to reclaim the home and life I had earned. This was the turning point, the quiet but unstoppable shift from victim to agent, from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. And so, with the deed in one hand and the locksmith's number in the other, I stepped toward a future where I would no longer be locked out of my own life, but welcomed back with the dignity and respect I deserved. The days that followed my quiet decision to reclaim the locks on the house were not marked by peace or easy victories, but by an intensifying struggle, a second escalation that tested not only my resolve, but my very sense of self. After arranging for the locksmith to come early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, and before anyone else stirred in the house that had become a fortress against me, I felt a mix of anticipation and fear. I paid the man in cash, the notes crisp in my hand, as if they carried the weight of every year I had fought to hold on to my independence. The locksmith was quiet but efficient, nodding with understanding when I explained what I needed. There was a sense of solidarity in that small act, a knowing that sometimes the simple act of turning a key could be a powerful assertion of freedom. When the new lock clicked into place, a lock that only I held the code to, I felt a surge of quiet triumph. It was not a loud victory, no shouts or celebrations, but a steady reclaiming of what was mine. The door, once an impenetrable barrier, was now a gateway again, not just to a house, but to my autonomy. I could enter on my own terms without waiting for permission or hoping for kindness. This was the physical manifestation of a deeper truth. I was still here, still capable, still worthy of respect. That evening, however, brought the confrontation I had anticipated but hoped to delay. Melissa arrived home later than usual, her expression tightening when she saw the new lock on the door. Her eyes flickered with anger and disbelief, but also with a fragile, barely contained fear. "You could have been confused," she said sharply, her voice low but edged with accusation. You could have hurt yourself. This isn't your house anymore. It's ours now." The words cut deeper than any raised voice, a reminder that this battle was not just about locks, but about control, about the shifting balance of power within our family. I met her gaze steadily, refusing to back down. "Check the deed," I said calmly, pulling the worn folder from my bag and laying it on the kitchen table between us. My name was there, printed clearly and without ambiguity. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of truths long ignored. Melissa's jaw tightened, and she looked away, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty beneath her anger. This was no longer a simple matter of protection or concern. It was a challenge to her authority, to the narrative she had constructed about my place in the family and the house. In the days that followed, the tension simmered beneath a fragile calm. Melissa's visits to the house became more frequent and more charged. She tried to assert her control in subtle ways, changing the thermostat without telling me, rearranging furniture in rooms I now had access to, speaking to contractors about renovations I was excluded from. Each act was a reminder that while I had reclaimed the locks, the battle for the soul of the home was far from over. Yet I refused to be intimidated or silenced. I met each challenge with quiet determination, standing my ground in conversations and insisting on being included in decisions. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Melissa and a lawyer she had brought into the house. Their voices were low, but the words were clear enough to cut through the walls. Guardianship, capacity, medical evaluations. It was the shadow of a threat, the looming possibility that if I did not comply, if I did not submit to their version of care and control, the law might be used against me. The thought was chilling, but it also steeled my resolve. I was not going to let fear silence me or strip me of my rights. I began to reach out quietly to advocates and legal aid groups seeking information and support. The house itself became a stage for this ongoing conflict. There were days when I found small signs of defiance. My husband's photograph returned to the mantel, a favorite chair restored to its place, the dog cautiously approaching me with a tentative wag of his tail. These moments were precious, reminders that I was not invisible, that the home I had built still held my presence. But they were also fragile, easily disrupted by Melissa's return, her footsteps sharp and deliberate, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Socially, the escalation manifested in increasingly strained interactions with family and neighbors. Invitations to gatherings came with strings attached. Conversations skirted around me, and I was often referred to in the third person, as if I were a guest or a visitor rather than a mother and owner of the home. Melissa's control extended beyond the walls of the house, shaping perceptions and narratives to suit her version of the story. It was a loneliness compounded by invisibility, a silencing that was both painful and enraging. Amidst this, I found unexpected allies. A neighbor who had watched the slow change with sympathy offered quiet words of encouragement and practical help. A longtime friend from the community center became a sounding board, reminding me of my strength and worth. Even the locksmith, who had installed the new lock, became a symbol of support, a reminder that I was not alone in this fight, that there were others who recognized the importance of autonomy and dignity at any age. The second escalation was not just a battle for a house, but a test of my spirit. It was a confrontation with those who sought to define my limits and rewrite my story. But it was also a revelation of my own resilience, a proving ground for the courage that comes from knowing one's worth. I discovered a well of strength I had not expected, a capacity for resistance that was as quiet as it was unyielding. In the quiet moments, When the house settled into night and the weight of the day lifted, I found myself reflecting on the journey so far. The locks, the legal battles, the shifting dynamics within my family were all part of a larger story, one of loss and recovery, of exclusion and reclaiming, of silence and voice. I was no longer just a woman who had been locked out. I was a woman who had taken the key back, who had stepped into her own power despite the odds. And yet, the path ahead remained uncertain. Melissa's anger simmered beneath the surface, and I knew that the struggle was far from over. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But I also knew that I had taken a stand that could not be undone, that I had drawn a line that others would have to respect. This was more than a fight for a house. It was a fight for my identity, my dignity, and my right to live on my own terms. It was a declaration that I would not be erased, that my voice mattered, and that the years I had lived were not to be dismissed or controlled by others. The second escalation was the crucible in which I forged a new sense of self. A woman who refused to be silenced or sidelined, who reclaimed her place in her home and her life with quiet but unshakable strength. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the necessity of standing firm, and the unyielding desire to be seen and respected. As I locked the door behind me one evening, holding the new keys firmly in my hand, I knew this was not the end, but a beginning. The battle had grown fiercer, but so had I. The house was still mine, and so was my story, and I was ready to live it fully, on my own terms. The moment I made the decision to send that letter was the moment I knew that everything had changed forever. It was not written in anger, nor was it an act of revenge. It was a calm, deliberate act of closure, a final severing of ties that had bound me for far too long. I took a deep breath, sitting at the kitchen table, the worn wood cool beneath my fingers as I carefully selected the pen and the paper. The house was quiet, the evening sun casting long shadows through the windows, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt a profound stillness settle within me, a stillness born of certainty and resolve. The letter was addressed not to my daughter nor to my son, but to the lawyer they had sent as a messenger, the official voice of the family's attempt to control me. The words flowed slowly but steadily, each sentence a brick laid in the foundation of my new autonomy. I told them that I was of sound mind and not under duress, that I had retained legal counsel of my own, and that any further attempts to interfere with my life under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. I signed it with a steady hand, the ink drying like a seal on my independence. It was the end of the negotiations, the arguments, the silent wars fought behind closed doors. This letter was my declaration that I was no longer willing to be anyone's object, their problem to solve, or their possession to manage. I was a woman reclaiming her life on her own terms, and I would not back down. After mailing the letter, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as though I had released a heavy burden I had carried silently for too long. The house, with all its memories and conflicts, suddenly felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where I could begin again. I moved the framed photograph of my late husband back to its place on the mantel, the familiar face smiling back at me like a guardian of the past and a witness to my present. I took back the favorite chair, settling into its worn cushions with a quiet satisfaction. Max, the dog, approached hesitantly at first, then curled up at my feet, sensing the change in the air, the return of something he had almost forgotten. The days that followed were filled with a strange mixture of calm and tension. Melissa did not respond immediately to the letter. There was a silence that stretched and folded over the house like a thick fog. It was a silence filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged pain. I knew she was struggling with the reality of my resistance, the fact that I was no longer willing to play the role assigned to me. But I also knew that this silence was a necessary space, a moment for both of us to breathe and reckon with the new boundaries I had set. In that space, I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece. I returned to routines I had abandoned, cooking meals that filled the house with familiar scents, tending to the garden where the old roses were stubbornly blooming again, and reconnecting with friends I had let drift away. I found strength in small acts of care and self-respect, each one a stitch mending the torn fabric of my life. I started to volunteer at the community center, sharing stories and laughter with others who had known loss and renewal. These connections became a lifeline, a reminder that I was not alone, and that my life still held meaning beyond the confines of family drama. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not from my daughter or son, but from my grandson, Kieran. His handwriting was large and deliberate, carrying the innocence of youth, but also the sincerity of someone reaching out without judgment or demand. He wrote of missing me, of wondering where I was, and of hoping that I was safe and happy. There was no guilt, no accusation, only a quiet longing to reconnect. Reading his words, I felt a warmth spread through me, a tender reminder of the bonds that still existed beneath the fractures. It was an invitation, soft and open, to rebuild a relationship on new terms, terms defined by respect, understanding, and freedom. That letter became a beacon in the unfolding story, a symbol of hope amid the complexities of family and identity. I responded in kind, writing to him about my new life, the small joys and challenges, and the slow reclaiming of my voice. Our correspondence grew, a steady thread weaving connection and healing through the fabric of distance and time. It was a relationship unburdened by past conflicts, a fresh start built on honesty and care. As the weeks turned to months, the final confrontation with Melissa came not in anger, but in a quiet meeting at the kitchen table. She arrived without fanfare, her eyes tired but softened by the passage of time and the inevitability of change. We spoke honestly, without blame or recrimination, acknowledging the pain and misunderstandings that had divided us. There were no grand promises or instant reconciliations, only a mutual recognition of the boundaries we needed to respect and the love that still lingered beneath the surface. In that moment, I realized that the climax of my journey was not a dramatic victory or a crushing defeat, but a nuanced understanding of myself and my family. It was the acceptance that freedom comes with complexity, that love can coexist with conflict, and that the true measure of strength is the courage to choose oneself, even when it means standing alone. The house, once a site of exclusion and control, had become a sanctuary once more, a place where I held the keys, not just to the front door, but to my own story. The locks I changed were more than mechanisms of metal and code. They were symbols of a woman who refused to be silenced, who reclaimed her life with quiet dignity and unwavering resolve. And so, as I stood in the doorway, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor, I knew that this was not an end, but a beginning of a life lived fully, on my own terms, with the knowledge that I had finally found the key to my own freedom. The days that followed the final confrontation brought a quiet, steady peace I had not dared to imagine in years. The house, once a place of conflict and exclusion, softened into a sanctuary where I could breathe freely again. I found myself returning to routines that had once been mundane, but now felt precious. The sound of water boiling for tea in the morning, the gentle rustle of pages turning in a well-worn book, the simple pleasure of sunlight streaming through the kitchen window and warming the old wooden table where I sat, with my hands wrapped around a cup. These moments, small and unremarkable to an outsider, were the stitches repairing the fabric of my life, weaving a new tapestry threaded with self-respect and quiet joy. Max, the dog who had once been cautious and distant, now greeted me each morning with a wagging tail and eager eyes, a living reminder that some bonds withstand even the longest silences. The garden, too, began to reclaim its former beauty as I tended the roses and herbs, nurturing life alongside my own renewal. The scent of earth and blossoms became a balm for my spirit, grounding me in the present and connecting me to the cycle of growth and healing that stretched beyond my personal struggles. In this newfound calm, I reconnected with Kieran, my grandson, whose letters had become a lifeline between the past and the future. Our correspondence blossomed into visits, first tentative and filled with the awkwardness of distance, then gradually more relaxed and filled with laughter. We shared stories over cups of tea, talked about books and music, and built a relationship not defined by old wounds, but by the hope of what could be. His presence was a gift, a bridge across generations, and a reminder that love could endure, evolve, and heal. I also found companionship in unexpected places. The community center, once a distant memory, became a place where I belonged again. The knitting group, the book club, and the afternoon tea sessions offered connection and purpose beyond the walls of the house. These friendships, born of shared experiences and mutual respect, enriched my days and reminded me that life's richness comes not only from family, but from the wider world we choose to embrace. Melissa's visits became less frequent, but more genuine. The tension between us softened into a cautious civility, an acknowledgement of the boundaries we had set and the space we now respected. There were no grand reconciliations, no promises to erase the past, but there was an understanding that we were both navigating new roles with care and respect. This was a relationship rebuilt not on control or obligation, but on acceptance and the fragile hope of renewed connection. The legal battles faded into the background, resolved through firm boundaries and clear communication. I kept the keys firmly in my possession, a symbol not just of property, but of the autonomy I had fought to reclaim. The house was mine, not just by deed, but by the quiet assertion of presence and will. Each day I lived there was a testament to resilience, a celebration of the power that comes from standing firm and choosing oneself. At night, I often sat by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one against the velvet sky. I thought about the journey I had traveled, from the shock of betrayal to the slow erosion of my place, from the spark of resistance to the final reclaiming of my life. It was a path marked by pain and courage, by loss and rediscovery, by silence, and finally, voice. I realized that the true victory was not in locking or unlocking doors, but in finding peace within myself. One evening, as the house settled into quiet sleep, I wrote a letter, not to my family or the lawyer, but to myself. I wrote of the strength I had found, the lessons learned, and the promise to never again let anyone dictate the terms of my existence. I tucked the letter into the drawer alongside old photographs and mementos, a private testament to the woman who had endured and emerged whole. This life, rebuilt from fragments of loss and hope, was no longer defined by the past, but by the choices I made each day. I was no longer waiting for permission or acceptance. I was living fully, with dignity and grace. The keys I held were not just metal and code, but the embodiment of a truth I had come to cherish, that a woman who owns her keys owns her story, her home, and ultimately herself. And if this story finds you, if you are sitting where I once sat, feeling the weight of exclusion and silence, know this: it is never too late to choose yourself. It is never too late to reclaim your voice, your dignity, and your life. The journey is hard, the road winding, but the destination is worth every step. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are enough. Hold your keys tightly, walk through your doors boldly, and live your story on your own terms. Because that is freedom and that is peace.